Well, good morning and welcome. It's good to be here. This is the second of our live Bible studies, and I'm really hoping that this is going on the stream as we speak. I'm just going to open another window and check whether it's on there. I think it's coming on. It might take a few seconds. It says, but yeah. So welcome to our second week of the Lent Bible studies. If you've looked at the first week, you'll know that we looked at Jesus coming down from the Mount of Olives and entering into Jerusalem, or beginning to enter Jerusalem. We had the whole bit about the procession into Jerusalem. This is week two. So Jesus has got into Jerusalem, and we're going to look at what happens when he hits the temple. But before we do that, we're going to have a word of prayer. Let's pray. Speak to us, gracious God, through the reading of your word, the discussion we shall have, and the prayers that are in our hearts, that our faith may grow and this fellowship be strengthened. Amen. So the sheet asks you to have a think about church buildings and what they're used for, which is quite interesting at the current time, because obviously church buildings aren't used for much at the minute with the coronavirus issue, but with a bit of luck we will soon be in a position where we can use our churches again. But just checking that is it over now? Anyway, I'm just going to continue with hopefully it'll record if nothing else. So yeah, our church buildings are not used for a lot, but the temple was hugely important in Jesus' time. It was used very much for pretty much social gatherings, for the kind of things that you would expect, for bar mitzvahs, but it was also a place of real importance for a whole wide range of life. Life revolved around temple sacrifices, worship, commerce, the economy relied heavily on the temple. So the temple is a real central focal point in the whole of Jesus' ministry, and we see it come time and time again that Jesus was at the temple, or Jesus did something at the temple, or there was an event, a festival that Jesus attends, and then usually all of the I am sayings tend to take place in some kind of festival that is occurring in the temple. We're going to move on though, because this passage that we're going to read focuses again on Jesus, what happens when Jesus hits the temple at the end of his ministry. Now, again, it depends on what gospel you read this in, because all four gospels have this issue of the temple being central, but John puts it right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry to make a point, whereas the synoptic gospels, they put it toward the end of Jesus' ministry. It's like the culmination of his mission and his ministry. That's partly because the three synoptic gospels see Jesus very much as the human rabbi Messiah, whereas what John does is he sees him much more as a divine figure. So it's about the motivation of Jesus' heart. That when they're writing their gospels, what they're trying to do is say, this is what was centrally important to Jesus. So, for example, Luke will talk about social justice and about the way Jesus includes people that otherwise haven't been included. Whereas John is much more like, what we're talking about here is that the temple is wrong, religious worship is wrong. We need to make sure that we get a different view of what God is and the divinity of Christ and how that plays into what we worship and how we worship. So that's pretty much why we get that situation with the differences in the gospel. We're not looking at John's gospel today, though. We're going to look at Matthew's gospel. Matthew 21:12-13. So I'm going to read that for you now, and you can have it on the screen so you can see it. I will take my ugly mug off so that you can focus on the words. But this is Matthew 21:12-13. Then Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it into a den of robbers." There's a couple of things that you need to recognise when we talk about this passage. The temple, as well as being kind of the central focal place, it's also it's on Temple Mount, and just like in this country, the land on which property is built is often owned by somebody different to who owns the building. So you have what's called a leasehold, and so the temple is effectively on leasehold. It's on a site that's owned by about 5 families, and these families are very, very, very wealthy families. I kind of think Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or Richard Branson. We're talking very, very wealthy people, and one of the things I want to kind of be generalising here, but one of the things that we know about very wealthy families and very wealthy people is that they get wealthy by, or they keep their wealth, usually by oppression. So when we look at kind of Amazon, we see oppressive working conditions within factories. We see the way in which they are denied toilet breaks, or they're knocked off their hours, or all those kind of things that we've heard about in the press about the way in which Amazon warehouses work. Same with Sports Direct. When you look at Richard Branson, you see a man who pays no tax in this country, who lives on an island, avoids the taxes in this country, and who basically is just laid off his staff on unpaid leave. So it's that sense of that they get wealth, they keep their wealth by being oppressive of some group or other, and it's the same with the temple. The temple, it charges huge amounts to the priests in order to maintain Temple on Temple Mount. So when they excavated Temple Mount, they found a whole range of kind of luxury items, from wine bottles to kind of jewels and all sorts of things. So the temple has to have kind of like a commerce and economic model that keeps it able to pay its dues to these 5 families. And it's very easy to blame the Pharisees, but I think we've all had the situations when we're in lockdown now, so there's no church services within the buildings, and the thing that goes through our mind is, well, how do we pay our assessment? Because we need to pay our assessment in order to pay our ministers, which is very, very important. So how do we say it? So how do we pay our assessment when we've got no income stream? So it's easy to blame the Pharisees and the temple kind of rulers, but the reality is that they have a duty to pay for the leasehold on the mount. Meanwhile, these 5 families get richer and richer and richer and richer, and poverty is huge in Israel at that time. It's running at 90% taxes, and it's really difficult to kind of make ends meet. So Jesus comes down into the temple and sees this state of affairs that is laid out before him with money changers in the courts of the Gentiles. The other thing kind of you really need to understand is the layout of the temple. And what I should have is put a slide in here that showed you the layout of the temple. Basically, it's split into different areas, and depending on your position within the religious community, it determines where you can go within the temple. So you've got the priests who draw a lot once a year to go into the central part of the temple, the Holy of Holies, and only one priest a year can go into that. So in Luke's Gospel, we read about Zechariah drawing lots and going in to serve the Lord within the Holy of Holies, and meeting the angel there who tells him he's going to have a child, and so he gets stricken. That's a different story, but it shows that only one priest can go in there. And then just outside that, you've got the kind of inner courtyard, the inner temple bit, which is for the main worship, and Jewish religious males who have had who've had their bar mitzvah and have become adults and been through all that, they can go in there, and that's where all the discussions and stuff take place. And you've got the outer courtyard, which is the courtyard of the women and the Gentiles. And the Gentiles and the women can go in there, and then you have, but only if they are considered to be clean. So that's no handicaps, that's no defects. So later on, and all of this ties in. This is the beauty for me of the kind of the gospel, is that everything ties into all this. So we have this whole system where the temple doesn't allow those people who are crippled or who are not whole to go into the temple. And then later on in the Gospels, we read that Stephen is not Stephen. Stephen is kind of walking along, and there's a carriage with a eunuch in it, and the eunuch's been to the temple to worship God, but obviously can't get into the temple. We don't hear that. That's written underlining the fact that we know that he's a eunuch, therefore we should know that he can't get into the temple. He's travelled all the way from Ethiopia to Jerusalem in order to worship at the temple and be turned away. And at that point we get this first baptism post Jesus' death. So all of this ties in, and that's the beauty. So Jesus comes into this place. The court of the Gentiles and the women is crowded, not with women and Gentiles, but with money changers, because you can't pay in normal currency. You have to pay in temple money, because that's the way in which they make their money, is by changing normal currency into temple money, and therefore then they can pay the taxes in normal money, but keep some money for themselves in temple tax. So it's all very complicated, really, but Jesus comes in and sees all of the money changers and the doves and the animal sellers, and he says, this is a place where we're supposed to be able to worship. Women and Gentiles should worship. They can't, because they're full of traders. So at that point, he turns the tables over. So we've got some questions on this section now. I'll take myself off the screen here for a bit. So we've got these questions. So what do you think was Jesus' real motivation? I'm going to not read them out. You can see them there on the screen, hopefully, and you can have a discussion. Again, this is all open to discussion and debate, and you may have different viewpoints on this to me, but about Jesus' real motivation and action within the temple. How do they speak in our lives today? What's the church amongst the community in which it's situated, and can we find a quietness within worship spaces? So this first one, Jesus' real motivation. I'm just going to have a slurp of my tea. That's good. I think Jesus' motivation, there is a sense of opening the temple up and recognising that all of this could take place outside the temple. It's also a sense of oppression of people again. It's back to this idea who is important and who matters, and the recognition that in many instances people simply don't matter anymore. That the people who are the poorest and the most vulnerable within our society, they have no role, they have no voice, that they are isolated and distant, and I think at this time at the minute as well, especially the way in which we have our housebound at the minute with coronavirus, and the most vulnerable people are the ones that get hit the hardest. And what Jesus is, I think, saying here is that the temple is supposed to be a place of peace, of quiet, of sanctuary, a place where the most vulnerable and weakest can go to realise that they're valued and they're loved, and that's not happening because of the segregation within the temple. And I think we do the same very much in our own churches. We segregate into those that have jobs, those that are important, those that are valued. We cringe when certain people come through the door, or that are difficult. We stick with our little cliques, and we become a closed shop. Which is why, in a sense, in both of the churches that I serve, that there's this sense, this huge push on hospitality, on the way in which we treat people, on the way people feel when they walk through our doors, that no one should be left behind, no one should feel undervalued, no one should feel that they don't belong. We have a sense of we should have a sense of belonging before believing and behaving, and yet we usually put behaviour before believing, and then belonging becomes last. So I think Jesus' actions here, and it is I think this is the point at which when people say, "What would Jesus do?" I always like to say, "Well, remember that there was a time when he turned tables over and got angry and drove people out with a whip." This is a real, point of conflict for Jesus. He does not like the fact that the weakest and vulnerable are not able to access God. Like I say, temple. The second question, temple was really, really important to society. It was the focal point. It wasn't just a religion. It's not like just a church. I think this is the thing that we can sometimes forget. We think that temple is like church, and it's not. It has way more political power. It is the voice of the community into the kind of Roman Empire at that time. It has a seat at the table. It's a bit like the Anglican Church and the House of Lords. It's that kind of role. It plays a really important part. So there's so much going on, and it almost prioritises one role over the other. So at that point in time, it's prioritising its political role in keeping Rome happy, rather than actually meeting the religious and spiritual needs of the community it serves. I think sometimes in church we can do the same again. We can, in a sense, become temple. We become more bothered about maintaining the status quo, about keeping our charitable status, about getting our gift aid in, about towing the line and being responsible in terms of obeying the law, rather than actually saying no, we speak out against injustice and oppression. So we become an area that is just for worship, just for kind of the Sunday morning, and we play no role in the further walk of society, and so we become an irrelevance to those people around us in our community. And I think that's the danger. That's almost what we need to kind of rediscover. How can we serve our community to the point that we become relevant again? And this coronavirus thing, I think, in a sense, from a ministerial point of view, certainly gives me that opportunity to kind of think about how do we reconnect with those people that are in their home and isolated. How do we maintain food banks? How do we maintain connectivity, rather than being socially isolated in the negative sense? So yeah. And the third question, are you able to find a quietness within your own worship space? And if not, how could that be achieved? One of the frustrations that I get time and time again with people is that people say to me quite often when they're talking about, specifically communion actually, when they're talking about communion, and they say, it's a lovely, peaceful time, we recognised it, but then when we got back to our seats, people were talking or chatting. At the beginning of the services, people gather in the foyer and they're kind of talking, and that's great, because for some people that's the only contact that they have in the whole week, is that sense of is that meeting point, and we fulfil that role. But by the same token, there should be a space for just being still. I remember a few years ago I'd done a funeral for a lady, and her partner came to the church for a couple of years for the anniversary of the death, and every time he came, he would say to me, "You know, I'm an atheist. You know, I'm an atheist, but here I find a peace, a space to think." And I think there's a lot to be said actually for not pushing the religion all the time, of just recognizing that God is around. God is in every kind of atom in our universe, and that actually, if we provide that space of peace, that place where people can find a moment's stillness, actually, God can do the work. I think sometimes we're too eager workers, rather than recognizing that actually we do nothing and God does the work, and that's that's where we need to maybe focus our attentions, providing opportunities for stillness and for calm. I know when we did the 24/7 prayer room down in the den, that was another place where people said that they found stillness and quiet, apart from when the exercise classes were on in the hall, but just a sense of peace and quiet, to allow God to act and to be. So we move on in the story. We're going to read Matthew again, chapter 21 again, but we're going to continue the reading. So this is Jesus coming. Remember, he's thrown the tables over of money lenders in the temple, and he has so he's thrown over the tables of the money changers and the lenders, and he then carries on. So I think he returns. No, he's still in the temple now. So he's still in the temple, and I'm going to take my camera off so that we can read this together. So we read. The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the amazing things that he did and heard the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they became angry and said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" Jesus said to them, "Yes, have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babes, you have prepared praise for yourself?" He left them, went out of the city to Bethany, and spent the night there. I think I might have gone off. Just going to check whether I'm actually still on, because it seems like on my OBS that I might have gone off. So let's have a look, just check. Says I'm not on, so oh yes, I'm sorry. It's fine. So I apologise for that. So the blind and the lame came to the temple, and he cured them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the amazing things that he did and heard the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they became angry and said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" Jesus said to them, "Yes, have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise for yourself?" He left them, went out of the city to Bethany, and spent the night there. This is actually more interesting than it appears, because, as I mentioned before, there are certain areas where people are allowed to come and be within the temple, and actually, the blind and the lame are not allowed in those areas. So what Jesus does, he turns the tables over, the money changers and the sellers of doves and beasts, and he opens the doors and allows the lame and the blind to come in and be healed right in the centre of the temple. I mean, this is, in terms of subversion and in terms of revolutionary activities, this is central. So we talked last week about about John Howard Yoder and his politics of Jesus. I think I did, didn't we? And this is the bit where we talked about the three temptations that Jesus faces in the wilderness being mirrored within the life of Jesus. This here is very much the mirroring of the throw yourself from the top of the temple, which was basically the punishment for blasphemy. This is Jesus saying it's almost like a desecration of the temple. It's along the lines of the Greeks, but not quite as bad. He kind of throws the tables over, so he destroys their economic model, and then he destroys their religious model of segregation and oppression by allowing the lame and the blind to come into the temple in order to be healed. And he heals them, he cures them. And it's not the amazing things that, I think when we, again, this interpretation of the word amazing is kind of slightly wrong. I think we get this idea that when they saw how amazing it was, how brilliant people were being healed, that's, I don't think, what is actually happening. I think when they mean amazing, it's kind of like the old-fashioned word of amazing, as in terrifying, the offensive, the kind of the things that go against their doctrines and teachings, the heretical stuff that he's doing there. It's amazing, as in not amazing wonderful, but amazing terrible, if you know what I mean. If that makes any sense at all, I don't know. I'm kind of waffling a bit, but when they see the things that he's doing, they're horrified. You know, it's not simply that that like they're annoyed that he's usurping them in the sense of that he's doing things that they wish they could do, and people are looking to him rather than to them. It's not a jealousy issue. This, for me, is a sense of them saying, you know, whoa, you cannot do this. There are rules, there are regulations. It's the equivalent of a non-ministerial person within Methodism presiding at communion. So we have strict rules in place as to who does communion, which are nonsense, to be perfectly frank. But hey, that's the way the church is. It's like, you know, it's even kind of worse than that. I can't quite get to words what would be the modern day equivalent, you know. But it's they don't see the good that's being done. What they see is the kind of the desecration of the temple, the kind of the uncleanliness of people coming into a place that is only for clean people. The, you know, children that are not part of that haven't yet been bar mitzvahed in the temple, crying out Hosanna to the Son of David. You know, it's like this is taking back temple for the communities, and the Pharisees do not like it, and they challenge him. You know, trying to get him to stop doing what he's doing. But almost like that police issue of saying, "Whoa, stop this! This is you're destroying everything we've worked for." You know, again, I have a bit of a soft spot for Pharisees and Sadducees because I think they are genuinely trying to do the best. They're trying to do what is right for God, but they just don't get it. They're just, you know, so it's this sense of we have worked hard to make this place clean, and you've come in and destroyed that, destroying it. Stop it now. He challenges, you know, it says, you know, that out of the mouth of babes and infants, you know, praise will come, and you know they speak. We say, you know, out of the mouth of babes, truth comes. But it's the same kind of message. And then so he leaves them, and he goes to Bethany, which is a place that's well known to him, and he spends the night there, away from the kind of the storm that he's kind of created within Jerusalem. So we have some more questions. What does this say about Jesus' priorities and ours? That's important. In the absence of traders and the children's voices can be heard singing. How spiritually perceptive can young children be in your experience, and what are the normal places of worship are you most aware of God's presence, and are there any visual aids within that space which help? Um, Obviously, these are kind of personal reflections. Um, this priority thing is really important for me. This idea that Jesus' priorities are different to the temple's priorities. For Jesus, it's all about people. It's all about individuals. It's all about people feeling that they are part of the community and a part of God's plans and God's love and grace. And I think that that's essential. That we miss out on so much when we're focused on ourselves, or when we're focused on religion above faith and above love. And I keep coming back to that 1 Corinthians 13, where Paul says, these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Jesus' priorities are not about, whether or not the service runs correctly. Jesus' priorities are not about whether the temple has enough to pay its assessment. Jesus' priorities are not about whether we read from the right version of the Bible, or whether whether our service structure has all the elements that it needs. Jesus' priorities are about the way people feel and the way people can access all of the things that they need to. This next question: in the absence of traders, children's voices can be heard singing. I think there is that sense of stillness that's gone. That's gone when you increase the number of traders in there. But I think again, this is children being allowed into areas that they're not. And so often within our churches, we have this model of children should be seen and not heard. This whole Victorian ideology that says that only adults can give truth. One of the things that I remember very strongly about Spring Harvest, and I've got some positives and I've got many negatives about Spring Harvest, but I remember the way in which Ishmael, who was Anglican vicar, children were central and were given so much authority in what they said. And I think there is that sense that actually, we become a church that is not open to children at our peril. We stifle kids' creativity all the time. As a former teacher, we used to do this. I used to see this all the time. Kids saying, "I can't do science," because that's what their experience was. When in fact they could. Science was all around them. They just had never. They'd been told they were wrong so often. That they just stopped asking, they stopped questioning, they stopped debating. And I think there's that sense of children should be heard in church. The sound of kids running around the church during service, I think is fascinating and fantastic. It shows that church is alive. It shows that children are valued and loved and cared for. And provided there are places and spaces for people to be still and quiet, the way children bring as exuberance and life into the church is fantastic. I remember, doing a communion once where we invited the children to come forward to the front, and they ran and put their hands out. And I remember to this day thinking, that's what we should all come to communion like. That's what we should all be kind of desperate for it. That eagerness to receive God's love and grace. Eagerness to be part of something bigger than ourselves. This is, for me, that's what having children in church is all about. And sadly, we don't have anywhere near, if any, children in our communities. And when we do, we don't value them. I don't think to the state that really we should. So I encourage you to welcome our children, to keep them, give them the run of the place, make it feel like it's their home, that we are coming into their home as opposed to the other way around. Where in your normal place of worship are you more aware of God's presence, and are there any visual aids within that space to help? Again, it's personal to you. You'll have places within Fulwell or Roker or wherever you're listening to this from that are special. I know I got into a lot of trouble for doing some stuff in the sanctuary, and I can understand that. I can understand that people have places that mean so much to them, places where they were married, they stood to get married, or they have funerals for their loved ones, places where they would sit with their grandparents or their parents that are now gone. There's so much tied up with our building, so much emotion and so much kind of history that we bring, that we don't even know that we bring it really, but that we bring. And I think there's an awareness. We need to have an awareness of that. It's difficult for me to talk about this, obviously, because I'm on the other side of the communion rail, as it were. But that sense that that if I'm in the church alone, there is a peace. And if you look at the back of Fulwell, there's a big painting there that was bought for me by my parents when they were at Spring Harvest one year, by an artist called Oliver Pengilly, who was a fantastic artist. And when I look at that picture, I'm reminded of my calling very much, and of God's, the very closeness of God in my life at that time. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on that. So we're going to continue. We're going to read from Matthew again. This is what happens afterwards. So this very much Jesus is retired to Bethany after this whole incident in the temple, and just make sure I get the right one. Just don't want the wrong slide going back up. So yeah, this is Matthew 21, 23 to 27, and at this point it's Jesus had that night of reflection back in Bethany, and now he's going to go into the temple again. This passage actually forms part of a much longer question and answer session. So the authorities are kind of battling back and forth with Jesus. They're trying to get some semblance of instruction and some semblance of understanding of where Jesus is coming from. Is he this heretical character that just is destroying the temple, or does he have authority from somewhere? Who has given him the right to do this? I suppose, in a sense, and it's a wonder for me, I wonder whether or not there is a fear that actually perhaps Jesus is kind of a usurper. Perhaps Jesus is actually part of the Roman establishment, that he's attempting to kind of undermine the temple's authority and kind of create more power for Rome, or maybe he's a cult leader. We look at our own world and see the number of times that cult leaders affect people's lives and damage people's lives. Is he after something for himself? But it doesn't seem to be, because he's showing so much love and grace. So this is what happens when he returns back to the temple. So when he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" Jesus said to them, "I will also ask you one question. If you tell me the answer, then I will also tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin?" And they argued with one another. If we say from heaven, he will say to us, "Why then did you not believe him?" But if we say of human origin, we are afraid of the crowd, for all regard John as a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And he said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." So again, this passage has so much in it that is that we don't kind of get in our world. This whole question and answer thing is a big Jewish kind of motif that runs throughout their religion, in terms of the way in which responses are often given. It's a bit like, I go through supervision. We have to do supervision now in the Methodist Church, and it's a wonderful gift from the church, where we meet with somebody that's in the church, a minister, usually a superintendent, minister from a different circuit, and we bring to them the questions and the concerns and the problems that we have. So if I have a problem with anyone in my church, or I have an issue that I can't deal with myself, I don't think I know the answer to, or I'm struggling putting sermons together or whatever, then during that supervision time, my supervisor will say to me, what would you like to talk about? And I might say, well, I'd like to talk about an issue that I have with a youth worker, let's say. And we'll deconstruct what the issue is. So then he'll ask me a question, and basically through that questioning session, I bring a question and he answers with a question, and I then question, and so it's like this dynamic of questioning and playing out with various different mechanisms and kind of techniques. I come up with the answer to my problem. So at no point does my supervisor give me the solution, and I think that's a really key issue. That actually what happens is that I know the answer to the problem. I know the answer to the question that I'm asking. I just need ways of actually discovering that answer for myself. And so through the question and answers of a supervisor, that becomes clear. And that's what kind of it's like a spiritual direction thing that the Jewish nation doing. I think it's a wonderful example of the way in which we kind of should work through problems. So there's no sense that I go to somebody who knows the answer. So these Pharisees and Sadducees, these leaders of the temple, they come to Jesus and they ask him, on whose authority does he do it? I mean, this could be a genuine question. They could genuinely be saying, look, you're a rabbi, you're teaching in the temple, so obviously you have some sense of authority. So who has given you that? Has it been kind of the chief priest? Has it been teachers of the law? Have you been through the training? Have you done this? It's like we could ask, how come you can stand up and be a local preacher? Somebody would say, well, I've done the course. I was put forward nominated by my church. I was recognised by circuit. Connection and district have recognised me by giving me the authority, having passed the exams. And so it's that chain of order that says not just anybody can come and talk rubbish in our churches, that we have to have some sense where we know that they have been authorised and recognised. And this is like a safety net. I think it's a really good safety net. In other churches, I know one of my friends, he pastored the church because his dad had pastored the church before him. So when his dad left, it was a case of, well, we need a pastor. Will you do it? He had no training. He had no sense of understanding of doctrine or biblical interpretation, or so the whole of the church's doctrine became what it says in the Bible is what it says in the Bible. There was, it was a fundamentalist church. There was no sense of freedom or ability to say, well, actually, look at the context and background. None of that was there, and it's a really dangerous position to be in that case. And that's, I think, what they're asking. Why? How are you doing this? Who is giving you permission to do this? And Jesus counters that with the other question about John. Now, that actually is part of the answer, because when Jesus says, who gave John the authority to do it, he's kind of harking back to his baptism, because the authority to do these things, again, a bit of cultural history for you. To become a rabbi, you basically go through the motions of your bar mitzvah. You learn the first 5 books of the Bible, then a bit more, and then a bit more. It's a bit like, so to become a rabbi, effectively, you've done your PhD, as it were. You've become a disciple. You've followed another rabbi around. First been accepted by that rabbi to follow him around by questioning and answering of the rabbi to check that your doctrine is in line with his doctrine. you follow that rabbi around for years until the point at which you come up with some new thought for yourself. When you come up with a new thought, or a new interpretation, or a new way of looking at the Bible, or a part of it, then you get tested again by two rabbis or two scholars. When those scholars have both agreed that what you have is legitimate and is not heretical, but is a new way of interpreting Scripture, at that point you become a rabbi. And then you can take on disciples that will follow you in your new interpretation of Scripture. So that's what they're asking Jesus. Who are the two rabbis that have authenticated your new direction, your new teaching, your new theology? And so Jesus answers that by asking, by whose authority did the baptism of John come from? Because if we remember back in the story, this is Matthew 21. So if you go back in the story to the very first beginning of Matthew's, after the birth narratives, you get Jesus being baptized by John in the Jordan. Authority number one. You then see, when he comes up out of the water, the Spirit of God descends upon him like a dove, and you hear the words, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased," or "who has found my favour," or whatever the interpretation of the Bible is that you read. Authority 2. So in terms of the rabbinic lineage, or as we would have in our church, the apostolic line, but the rabbinic line of authenticity, Jesus calls on the authentication of John and of God. Those are the two rabbis that have authorized his message. That's why the confusion comes, because they cannot say that, well, that doesn't exist because John wasn't a prophet or John wasn't a rabbi, because the people believed that he was. They can't say, okay, that's justified, because then they know that you get this thing back. Well, why didn't you stand up for John when the whole role of the oppressed within society? John was oppressed and beheaded. Why did you not kick off about that? It's like, well, if we kicked off, we'd have been put to death as well, because Herod's this horrific ruler and leader. And they can't counter the anointing by God, because they themselves say they've been anointed by God. So this whole issue becomes a real kind of minefield, and that's why he won't tell them they won't answer it. So, cutting to the questions. Why didn't the authorities simply ask the question that was probably in their minds, namely, are you the Messiah? Well, I don't think they could do that. I mean, I think that's, in the past, it's not a sense of, Jesus would have just counted it anyway with, who do you say I am, in the same way that he did with other people that said that. I think also there's a whole political intrigue with saying that. If you say to Jesus, are you the Messiah? Then you stand to then have to respond to that. If he says yes, what's the cost to the Roman Empire if that's the case? Does the temple suddenly come against the Roman Empire? Plus, their whole understanding of what Messiah means is different to what Jesus is anyway. So, I think it's a bit of a leap to say that's probably in their minds, the Messiah. I think potentially they think, if at the very least he's a heretic, maybe a cult leader, and that maybe the Messiah wouldn't say, yes, I am the Messiah, because there's a whole humility issue. Plus, Messiah just means anointed by God, and kind of Jesus answers that question anyway. I think that's an odd question to ask, actually, but yeah, you can discuss that and see what you think. The second question, I think that the ministry and mission of John the Baptist is hugely important to Jesus' ministry, because I don't know about the success of Jesus' mission, but certainly we have to remember that John is the older cousin of Jesus, and presumably Jesus would be well aware of who he was. So I think there's that sense of looking up to the older cousin and recognising the being influenced in terms of the whole distancing from temple. Again, John the Baptist, we have to recognise, is the son of a priest, which suggests that basically he should have gone into the priesthood. He would have. That's the way it worked. That priests. He was part of the Levite tribe, so they would have gone down that priestly route. The reality is that he doesn't. He rejects the temple, and I think that is a key point to Jesus. That seeing John reject temple is part of that formation of Jesus's understanding of what his role is and what God is calling him to. That sense that the religion is not the answer, that the faith and love is the answer, and that the religion is secondary. Have you ever had the sense of God's planning in the way you're like, kind of, yeah, I could say. It's a bit difficult for me to answer that question for you, given that I'm in ministry, so it kind of sums it up. God has plans that are above and beyond the things that I've chosen. Let's be honest. If you're choosing a job, it's not necessarily ministry. I always remember when I was a teacher and said I was going into ministry, kids would say to me, "Is it more money?" Because that's what drove them. And telling them that I was halving my salary was not in their consciousness. They couldn't kind of grasp that. But not just then. I'm not just in the call to ministry. There's been loads of sense of God's planning. The way in which my, it's difficult, isn't it? Because you can turn around and say that anything is God, but my lack of work for A levels and degrees and things, that I would say that my lack of interest in the subject that I was studying actually made me realise what was important in life, and I think that's more like it. I think that God leads us to actually that formation of what is important, what really matters in life, and that sense that people matter more than profit. So I think that's mine. And what are the den of robbers exploiting people today? Well, there's all sorts of things, isn't there? There's political systems that put profit before people. We look at this height of the coronavirus and say, well, we're not even in the height now, are we? But the fact that our leaders just won't say no, everything shuts, like some other countries have. That we're kind of being recommended not to. We'll do the best thing. I listened to a lot of podcasts. There was one that Michael Portillo did. Michael Portillo is a Tory politician, or was a Tory politician, Conservative, who served in Margaret Thatcher's government, and said, I heard a podcast on him on the role of capitalism, and the question was, has capitalism failed as a market model, as a model? And funnily enough, he was arguing that whilst he still said that the free market economy was a good thing, that actually the role of capitalism as it is today is wrong. And he talked about Margaret Thatcher having a genuine belief that if you took the prescriptive taxation of big business and big people and people with lots of money, they would become altruistic, and they would do what was the right thing as opposed to what was good for them. That it was more beneficial for rich people to give their money willingly than to have it taken from them in in taxes. And Michael Patella says she firmly believed that that would be the case. And clearly, as we know now, 30 years, 20 years after Thatcher, no, 25 years after Thatcher, something like that, we clearly know that that simply is not the case, that rich people will keep their money and they will exploit those people that they can exploit in order to get more money. Richard Branson last week wanted a bailout of Virgin Atlantic, the airline. He wanted the government to put all of his staff onto unpaid leave for 3 months, and which would cost him, I think, £7.5 million. And he wanted a bailout of the government, £7.5 million to pay for that. Now, this is a man who's worth £4.1 billion, who doesn't pay any tax in our country. I know I'm getting all political and ranty here, but the reality is that, you know, paying that or even if it was 750, even if it was £1.1 billion, whatever it was, you know, it still leaves him with a vast fortune. It wouldn't blink, and yet we're expected as taxpayers to bail out companies that that kind of simply, obviously their market model is there, just because of a crisis for a time period, their market model isn't there, and so they want this bailing out. You know, and I think the argument of, well, we bail out people, not companies. We'll cover the wages of those people while they're on unpaid leave, but we will not give money to the government, to the corporations. And the, you know, EasyJet wanted the bailout and then paid some vast sum, 7 million or 1 point something million in kind of dividends to shareholders, and £60 million to the owner. I mean, it doesn't equate at all. You know, so we see those companies that are making vast fortunes exploiting people to get them. You know, but you can go further. You can say, well, the British Empire was built upon exploitation. You know, we kind of travelled the world and took all of the resources from those countries that had it. So dens of robbers. I mean, you'll have all sorts of things in your own mind, you know, that you can think about on that. But yeah, I do have you know, discussion on this. I think I've probably ranted on now for long enough, and so I think I'm going to kind of end it there. But I hope this has been useful. I know it's been me waffling a bit maybe, and pontificating as usual. But yeah, I think that this time, when we're struggling to kind of do things, you should have had the material emailed to you. If you haven't had the material for this email to you, then if you give me a shout, then I can send it on to you. Or if you want, I know I'm delivering some to people who haven't got internet. So if you or you know somebody that would prefer it dropped in to their doors, then if you can let me know, give me a ring, then I can drop that in to them. But I think we should close with a word of prayer. So if you'd like to join me in praying, let's pray. Dear Lord, as we come before you at this time, as we recognise your scope in this world and your love for this world, as we explore the journey of Christ to the cross in that last week, as we think about all the things that went on during his life and what that means for us today, we pray, Lord, that you will give us a comfort and a strength, that you will enable us to cope with these difficult times ahead, and that you, more than just allowing us to cope, will show us how we can best serve you in the situation we're in. Pray, Lord, that you will point us in the direction of those people who are lonely and who need your care and your love. And may we know above all things that we are loved and precious in your eyes. In Christ's name we ask this. Amen. So thank you, and take care, and look after yourself and one another, and I will see you shortly. We will be doing some other things. I'll throw in some short prayers during the week, and also I'll throw in the service will be again streamed next week, so you'll be able to catch up on that. But take care, and God bless.